Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Thursday, February 5th, 2026, and you're listening to Alex's News. The high in Riverside today is 80 degrees, with a low dipping to 57.4, so expect a mild, sunny day perfect for getting outside without overheating. Coming up, we'll examine the consequences of the New START Treaty's expiration on global nuclear arms limits and unpack the factors behind the sharp decline in EPA regulatory actions during Trump's second administration. Plus, other key developments from around the world, including breakthroughs in space exploration and economic shifts. All this and more coming up on Alex's News. Stay tuned. This morning marks a historic and unsettling moment in global security. The last major nuclear arms control treaty between the United States and Russia has officially expired. Ethan is here to break down what that means. Ethan, what exactly ended today?
New START, the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, formally ran out of time today, Thursday, February 5th, 2026. It was the final legally binding agreement limiting the nuclear arsenals of Washington and Moscow, the two biggest nuclear powers on the planet. According to detailed coverage in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette and NBC affiliates like WBAL in Baltimore, this is the first time in more than half a century that their strategic nuclear forces are essentially unconstrained by treaty limits. That is why a lot of experts are calling this a historic turning point, and not in a good way.
Why are people saying this is such a big break from the past?
Since the 1970s, there has always been some kind of framework, putting ceilings and rules around U.S. and Russian, or previously Soviet, nuclear weapons. Now, for the first time in over 50 years, there are no legal caps and no agreed-upon inspections between them. Analysts quoted by the Post-Gazette and by KSBW in Monterey say it feels like a step back toward a looser, more anxious Cold War-style environment, only with more players and more advanced technology. The concern is less about something happening today, and more about what the next 5 or 10 years could look like without guardrails.
For people who have not followed this, what did New START actually do?
At its core, New START put hard numbers on the most dangerous weapons. Each side was limited to no more than 1,550 deployed strategic nuclear warheads on long-range missiles and heavy bombers. They could field up to 700 deployed delivery systems like intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched missiles, and bombers, and no more than 800 launchers total, counting some that were not loaded. As WBAL explained in its explainer pieces, those rules applied only to long-range, so-called strategic weapons that can hit each other's homelands, not the shorter-range tactical weapons or the forces of other countries.
And it was not just about counting warheads and missiles, right?
Exactly. The verification piece was actually the heart of the treaty. New START required up to 18 on-site inspections per year, where teams could literally go into bases, count launchers, and confirm what the other side declared. It also mandated detailed data exchanges every 6 months and thousands of notifications every year about movements, exercises, and missile deployments, plus some sharing of test launch telemetry. The Pittsburgh Post-Gazette noted that over a decade, those tools gave both sides a reasonably clear picture of what the other was doing, which helped avoid worst-case assumptions.
How did we end up here if the treaty had been working reasonably well?
The path to today has been a slow erosion rather than one big blow. New START was signed in Prague back in April of 2010 by President Barack Obama and Russia's then-president Dmitry Medvedev, and it entered into force in 2011. It was originally supposed to expire in 2021, but about 5 years ago, in early 2021, President Joe Biden and President Vladimir Putin agreed to a one-time 5-year extension, which carried it to today and could not be renewed again under the treaty's terms. So everyone knew this deadline was coming, but political relations have only gotten worse in the meantime.
At what point did inspections and those verification tools actually stop?
The first real crack came about 6 years ago, in 2020, when both sides agreed to pause inspections because of the COVID pandemic. As Associated Press reporters cited by WBAL pointed out, That temporary pause was never lifted. For a while, both governments fell back on satellites and their own intelligence, sometimes called national technical means, to keep an eye on each other. But the real rupture came later, once the war in Ukraine reshaped the relationship.
So what happened once Russia invaded Ukraine?
In February of 2023, about 3 years ago, President Putin announced that Russia was suspending its participation in New START. He halted all inspections, stopped the regular data exchanges, and cut off notifications, accusing the United States and NATO of using Ukraine as a proxy to weaken Russia and saying foreign inspectors at Russian nuclear sites were a security risk during wartime. According to the Post-Gazette's coverage, Moscow insisted it would still honor the numerical limits, but Washington had no way to verify that, and the United States then suspended its own inspections and data sharing in response. From that point on, the treaty was technically alive but practically on life support.
Were there serious last-minute efforts to rescue it or replace it?
There were attempts, but they never really lined up. The Bilateral Consultative Commission, the joint body created to troubleshoot the treaty, apparently had not met since 2018, leaving no regular venue to hash out problems. In the fall of 2024, Russia floated the idea of a voluntary one-year extension of the warhead cap even after formal expiration, but only if the United States matched it. By yesterday, though, the Russian Foreign Ministry was saying that without reciprocity, both sides were, quote, no longer bound by any obligations or symmetrical declarations, end quote, essentially declaring the old rules dead.
You mentioned something that happened just yesterday with China. What was that about?
On Wednesday, February 4th, just 1 day before expiration, President Putin spoke with Chinese President Xi Jinping about the issue, according to Kremlin advisor Yuri Ushakov, in remarks reported by KSBW and others. Shortly after, Moscow hardened its line that unless Washington agreed to Russian conditions, it was, in its words, fundamentally free to choose its next steps. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov called the expiration negative, but he also emphasized that Russia would act, quote, responsibly and thoroughly, end quote, with its national interests first. That mix of regretful tone and firm red lines has been a consistent theme from Moscow.
How is the Trump administration framing its position now that we are officially past the deadline?
President Donald Trump in his second term has been arguing that any new arms control deal has to include China, not just Russia. In a January interview with the New York Times, cited in WBAL's coverage, he said, quote, I actually feel strongly that if we are going to do it, I think China should be a member of the extension. China should be a part of the agreement, end quote. His team, including Secretary of State Marco Rubio, has been saying 21st century arms control is impossible without Beijing at the table. That stance has made a quick, simple U.S.-Russia replacement treaty much harder to imagine.
And what is China saying about being pulled into all this?
Chinese officials acknowledge their arsenal is growing, but they still describe it as much smaller than those of the United States and Russia. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lin Jian has pushed back on the idea of immediate trilateral talks, urging Washington and Moscow to first resume their own dialogue and, at least for now, keep observing the old New START caps voluntarily. Beijing says it is open to broader strategic discussions but not ready for formal disarmament negotiations, quote, at this stage, end quote. That leaves the United States insisting on a bigger table, and China saying, not yet.
You hinted Russia has its own conditions too. What does Moscow want?
Russian officials have suggested that if China is going to be included, then Britain and France, the other two established nuclear powers in NATO, should also be part of the negotiations. They have also increasingly tied arms control progress to issues like Western military support for Ukraine, implying that there can be no serious talks while weapons continue to flow to Kyiv. That linkage, reported by several European outlets, essentially mixes nuclear bargaining with battlefield leverage. It adds another political hurdle on top of the technical ones.
Let's talk numbers for a moment. Where do the arsenals stand right now?
Estimates from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI, put both the United States and Russia at roughly 5,000 total warheads each when you count active, stored, and those awaiting dismantlement. Under New START's deployed limits, each kept somewhere in the range of 1,400 to 1,500 warheads ready for use on long-range systems. Because inspections stopped and data has not been exchanged in years, recent analyses by open-source groups, cited by the Federation of American Scientists, suggest both sides may have quietly crept up toward roughly 1,700 operationally deployed warheads by late last year, exploiting gray areas like how bombers are counted. So even before today, the line was already getting fuzzy.
So are we already in a new arms race? Or is that overstating it?
Many experts say a kind of slow-motion arms race has been underway at least since Russia's suspension in 2023. SIPRI, the Nuclear Threat Initiative, and the Arms Control Association all argue that, in practice, both sides have been modernizing and preparing to upload more warheads onto existing missiles once treaty limits disappeared. Russia has been fielding new systems like the Avangard hypersonic glide vehicle and experimenting with exotic weapons like the Burevestnik cruise missile, while the United States is developing the Sentinel intercontinental ballistic missile and new submarine-launched warheads. As the Post-Gazette put it, today's expiration does not start that race so much as it removes the last legal speed limit sign.
How have other countries and international organizations reacted since the treaty actually expired?
The mood has been one of alarm. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres called this, quote, a grave moment for international peace and security, end quote, urging Washington and Moscow to get back to the table, as reported by The Guardian. The Trump administration has publicly played down the urgency, saying there are no immediate plans to exceed the old limits and insisting the president will move on what he calls his own timeline. Russia, meanwhile, has warned it will take what it calls decisive military technical countermeasures if the United States starts rapidly adding warheads or deploying new systems close to Russia, including in places like Greenland.
For people listening at home, does this change their personal risk today, right now?
In the very short term, nothing dramatic changes on the ground. No one is talking about launching missiles today or tomorrow, and both governments understand that a nuclear exchange would be catastrophic. The real danger is that over time, without rules and transparency, both sides may start planning for worst-case scenarios, adding more weapons and keeping them on higher alert. That kind of environment raises the long-term risk of miscalculation or a crisis spiraling out of control.
You mentioned verification collapsing as a key concern. Why does losing inspections matter so much?
When you can send inspectors into each other's missile fields and bomber bases, you can check whether the other side is actually doing what it says. Without that, you have to rely on satellites and electronic intelligence, which can tell you a lot but not everything, especially about what is loaded on a missile or stored in a bunker. UN disarmament researchers at UNIDIR say that when transparency shrinks, countries tend to assume the worst and build up to hedge against secret cheating. That spiral of suspicion is exactly what arms control was designed to prevent.
Are we already seeing signs on the ground that both sides are preparing to ramp up?
Yes, at least on the Russian side, open-source analysts have spotted some telling moves. Satellite imagery from 2024 and 2025, examined by the Federation of American Scientists and experts at the Carnegie Endowment, shows silo modifications at Russian missile bases like Kozelsk and Tatashevo, consistent with preparing to house multiple Warhead Yars missiles that could quickly increase deployed numbers. On the U.S. side, officials have long said their existing missiles and submarines could carry many more warheads than they do now, a capacity sometimes called upload potential. So even without building brand new missiles, both arsenals could grow in a matter of years, simply by loading more warheads onto current systems.
How does the ongoing war in Ukraine play into all of this?
It is a huge complicating factor. NATO's support for Ukraine has deepened Russia's distrust, and Russian officials increasingly argue that you cannot separate nuclear negotiations from what they see as a broader confrontation with the West. Arms control advocates, quoted by the Arms Control Association, warn that nuclear talks are now hostage to progress, or lack of it, on the battlefield. That means even proposals that might make sense on their own run smack into larger political grievances.
Outside of Europe and North America, are there worries about more countries wanting their own nuclear weapons now?
Yes, and that is one of the biggest long-term fears. If the two largest nuclear powers are no longer constrained by treaties, it undercuts the credibility of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which asks most countries to stay non-nuclear while the big powers move toward disarmament. Analysts quoted by the Japan Times say debates are already intensifying in countries like Japan and South Korea about whether to rely solely on the U.S. umbrella or consider other options. In Europe, you also hear more open talk in Poland and elsewhere about wanting stronger, more visible nuclear guarantees, which could fuel pressure for changes inside NATO.
Even with New START gone, are there any guardrails still in place between Washington and Moscow?
There are a few older safety nets that still matter. The direct communication line, often called the hotline, that dates back to 1971, remains in place, and there is a separate late 80s agreement requiring advance notice of ballistic missile launches. Those do not limit numbers, but they help prevent accidents and misread signals, especially during tests. Experts at Chatham House say preserving and perhaps updating those mechanisms is crucial, while broader arms control remains stalled.
If the main treaty is gone, what are experts suggesting as a plan B?
A lot of the discussion now is about informal or partial measures. The Arms Control Association and former U.S. officials like Thomas Countryman have floated ideas like both sides voluntarily keeping their deployed warheads near the old New START caps and resuming some level of data exchange, even without a full-fledged treaty. Another proposal is to upgrade the so-called P5 process, involving the 5 recognized nuclear states under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, into a more serious negotiating forum to at least freeze stockpiles. None of that is as strong as a ratified treaty, but analysts argue it is better than having nothing at all.
How would verification work if inspectors are no longer flying into each other's bases?
One concept highlighted by the Federation of American Scientists is what they call inspections without inspectors, using high-resolution commercial satellites, including synthetic aperture radar, to monitor missile fields and submarine ports in near real time. UNIDIR has also suggested demonstrative verification, where a country would unilaterally open a facility or a dismantlement process to foreign observers or cameras to build confidence. On top of that, you could have slimmed-down notifications, focusing on big changes like new missile types or large deployments. It is more patchwork than the old regime, but it could restore some transparency.
The Trump team often talks about a future three-way deal with China. How realistic is that in the near term?
Strategists at places like the Atlantic Council say the United States does have leverage, because it could threaten to upload a lot more warheads, unless China agrees to some sort of ceiling. But Beijing has signaled it wants the United States and Russia to cut far deeper first, to levels closer to China's much smaller arsenal, before it accepts formal limits. There is also a basic trust gap, with Chinese officials skeptical that Washington would actually live by any agreement long term. So while a trilateral framework is an attractive idea on paper, most experts see it as a medium to long-term project, not something that will replace New START quickly.
What role could Europe's nuclear powers, France and the UK, play now?
Some European strategists talk about a kind of Euro-nuclear pillar, where Britain and France coordinate more closely and possibly engage Moscow directly on stability measures. Russia, for its part, has said if China is at the table, then French and British forces must be counted too, since they are part of NATO's overall posture. Any broader deal would eventually have to reckon with those arsenals, even though they are much smaller. In the meantime, clearer communication from Paris and London about their own modernization plans could help reduce uncertainty.
Compared to the height of the Cold War, how different is this moment?
During the Cold War, the world lived under far larger arsenals, tens of thousands of warheads. But over time, there was a dense web of treaties and hotlines to manage that danger. Today, the total numbers are lower, but you have more nuclear-armed states, emerging technologies like cyber and hypersonic weapons, and now far fewer binding rules between the main players. The International Institute for Strategic Studies describes it as moving into an unregulated tripolar nuclear era, with the United States having to deter both Russia and China at once. That combination makes the risk profile very different from the old U.S.-Soviet standoff.
Are there practical limits that might keep both sides from just building endlessly more weapons?
Absolutely. Money and politics still matter. Modernizing nuclear forces is staggeringly expensive. U.S. programs like the Sentinel missile and new ballistic missile submarines carry price tags in the hundreds of billions of dollars over time. And Russia's economy is under strain from sanctions and the costs of the Ukraine war. In Washington, there is already debate in Congress about how much nuclear spending is enough, especially with other priorities like conventional forces and social programs. Those budget pressures could act as a brake on the most extreme arms race scenarios, even without treaties.
What are arms control advocates warning about most urgently right now?
Groups like the Nuclear Threat Initiative and the Arms Control Association are using pretty stark language. They describe today as close to a death knell for 50 years of step-by-step nuclear restraint, and they worry that if Washington and Moscow do not find some replacement, the broader non-proliferation system could unravel. Their immediate asks are fairly modest: restart talks at any level, reestablish some data sharing, and publicly commit not to rush into massive buildups. They argue that even symbolic moves could buy time and lower the temperature.
How is the public reacting, especially in communities near key nuclear bases?
Local coverage from stations like WBAL in Maryland and KSBW in California has highlighted a mix of anxiety and fatigue. Residents near submarine ports and bomber bases are very aware they live alongside potential nuclear targets, and some local officials are asking for clearer federal briefings on what the expiration means. At the same time, after years of other crises, from pandemics to inflation, nuclear risk can feel abstract until a specific incident brings it home. That disconnect is part of why many experts say leaders need to communicate more plainly about both the dangers and the options.
Do leaders in Washington and Moscow actually acknowledge how risky this could become?
They do, but usually wrapped in talk about responsibility and deterrence. Dmitry Peskov keeps emphasizing that Russia will take a, quote, responsible, thorough approach to stability, end quote, while also insisting it must defend its interests. White House officials say the United States will not make rash moves and has no immediate plan to break past the old limits, but they also stress that the president wants maximum flexibility in case Russia surges ahead. So both sides publicly nod to stability, yet keep all their options on the table, which is exactly what makes outside observers nervous.
There has been talk about big new missile defenses, like something nicknamed the Golden Dome. How does that fit in?
The idea, associated with some of President Trump's speeches and picked up in analysis by institutes like IISS, is a far more ambitious shield against enemy missiles. Russia and China see large-scale U.S. missile defense as potentially undermining their ability to retaliate, which is the core of nuclear deterrence. If they fear their smaller arsenals might be blunted, they have a strong incentive to build more offensive warheads to overwhelm any shield. That is why many arms control experts argue missile defense and offensive limits really have to be discussed together.
Looking ahead just to the next year or so, what concrete steps could reduce the danger?
In the near term, even quiet, informal understandings could help. Washington and Moscow could privately agree not to significantly increase their deployed warheads beyond where they are now, and they could restart at least partial data exchanges about major changes in their forces. Reconstituting some version of the bilateral commission that used to oversee New START, even as a working group, would give diplomats a place to talk regularly. None of that fixes the problem, but it would slow the slide into a completely unregulated environment.
Bottom line, Ethan, how should listeners think about this turning point?
It is not a reason to panic today, but it is a serious warning sign about where we might be headed if nothing changes. The expiration of New START removes guardrails that took decades to build, at exactly the moment great power tensions are already high. History shows that big breakthroughs in arms control often come after periods of real danger, when public and allied pressure pushes leaders back to the table. The question now is whether Washington, Moscow, and eventually Beijing choose to treat this as a wake-up call or just another headline to move past.
A lot to take in this morning. Ethan, thanks for helping us understand what this means.
Always glad to help unpack it, Grace.
Our top environmental story this morning is a watchdog report accusing the Trump administration's EPA of virtually abandoning enforcement. Chloe is with us. Chloe, what did this report find?
The Environmental Integrity Project, a nonpartisan watchdog, says EPA enforcement in President Trump's second term hit a historic low last year. According to their analysis, in all of 2025, the agency started only 16 civil court cases against major polluters. The group's executive director, Jen Duggan, told reporters this is not just a slowdown, but a, quote, collapse of federal enforcement, end quote. That report came out today, February 5th, 2026, and NPR's Climate Desk quickly highlighted it as a major shift in how the EPA is doing its job.
16 cases sounds very low, but how does that compare with past administrations?
The contrast is stark. The Washington Post and NPR, citing the same data, note that in President Obama's second term, his first year, back in 2013, the Justice Department filed roughly 123 of those big civil cases. President Biden's first year, 2021, saw around 71, and even Trump's own first term started about 75 such cases. Going from those numbers down to 16 in 2025 works out to an 87% drop from Obama's benchmark and more than 3/4 down from both Biden and Trump's earlier records.
What kinds of cases are we talking about here? And why do they matter so much?
These are the heavy hitters, the lawsuits the EPA sends to the Justice Department under laws like the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act. NPR's Jeff Brady explains these are usually aimed at big industrial plants, refineries, power stations, and massive wastewater systems, the kinds of operations that can foul air and water for entire regions. Because the penalties can be huge and the court orders are legally binding, they are considered the agency's strongest deterrent. When those big cases dry up, watchdogs like Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility say large polluters start to believe there is very little risk in breaking the rules.
And it is not just the new lawsuits, right? What did the report say about settlements and fines?
Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, or PEER, dug into Justice Department data and found only 15 civil settlements in EPA cases last year. That is a fraction of what we saw under Biden or Trump's first term, when those numbers were more than 70 in each of their first years. On top of that, administrative penalties, the fines the EPA can issue on its own without going to court, plunged as well. Through September of last year, the EPA had collected about $41 million in those penalties, which is noticeably lower than comparable periods under both Biden and Trump's first terms, even after adjusting for inflation.
There was also another group, the Environmental Data and Governance Initiative, looking at broader enforcement trends. What did they find?
That group, often called EDGI, teamed up with the Environmental Integrity Project, and they combed through the EPA's own enforcement database. Their report, also released today, found that in 14 of 24 enforcement categories, activity was at either the weakest or second weakest point in roughly 2 decades. They also saw inspections dropping, including those under the Toxic Substances Control Act, which regulates dangerous chemicals. According to coverage on regional NPR stations, inspections under that law fell by more than 1/3 compared with 2024, meaning fewer chances to even spot violations in the first place.
So if enforcement is shrinking across the board, what reasons are being given for this drop?
The watchdogs point to a mix of staff losses, budget moves, and policy changes. On the staffing side, E&E News reports that at the Justice Department's Environmental Division, at least 1/3 of the lawyers handling EPA cases left during 2025, pushed out by early retirement offers, transfers, or resignations. NPR's Jeff Brady notes that without enough government attorneys, even when the EPA identifies serious violations, many of those cases just never make it into court. At the same time, the administration has proposed deep cuts to the EPA's budget and workforce, including furloughs during last year's government shutdown that sidelined much of the enforcement staff.
You mentioned policy changes. What is different about how the EPA says it wants to enforce the law now?
EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin has embraced what the agency calls a swift compliance or compliance first approach. In a December 2025 memo, sometimes referred to as the Pritzlaff memo and covered by NPR, the agency said it will focus on informal fixes, technical advice, and letting states take the lead, rather than what it described as overzealous federal lawsuits. EPA Press Secretary Bridget Hirsch told reporters this model aims to resolve violations more quickly without, in her words, crippling industry. That philosophy closely tracks with a conservative blueprint known as Project 2025, which openly calls for shrinking EPA's authority in favor of fossil fuel and manufacturing interests.
That raises the question, are states actually stepping up their own enforcement to fill the gap?
According to EDGI and the Government Accountability Office, the answer is largely no. Reviews cited by outlets like Connecticut Public show that even before 2025, more than 24 states had cut their environmental agency budgets when you account for inflation. Then, under the Trump administration's new budget proposals, key federal grants to states, including clean water revolving funds, face billions of dollars in cuts. The Center for American Progress warns this is creating what they call a race to the bottom, where states are hesitant to crack down hard on industry because they are competing for jobs and investment.
How is the EPA responding to all these criticisms? Are they just ignoring the report?
They are pushing back hard. Bridget Hirsch emailed NPR and several regional public radio stations, calling the watchdog report, quote, erroneous and misleading, end quote. The agency argues that if you only count new court filings, you miss the broader picture of how many cases they are actually resolving. To support that, they released their own enforcement figures for 2025, saying they concluded more than 1,778 cases, which they claim is in line with or better than recent years.
That sounds like a big number. Is that the whole story, though?
Not really, and NPR's coverage has been careful to unpack the nuance. A large share of those case conclusions in 2025 were investigations or lawsuits that actually began under President Biden's administration and were simply wrapped up last year. Independent analysts looking at the EPA's database, including EDGI and legal commentators quoted by Fox Rothschild, found that the number of newly started enforcement actions is still scraping the bottom. And many of the administrative cases that are being brought now involve relatively minor paperwork issues, not the large industrial violations that typically drive major pollution reductions.
Were there any areas where enforcement actually increased under Trump's second term?
There were a few narrow exceptions. One area the agency points to is pesticide imports under the federal FIFRA law, where it brought more than 80 administrative cases last year, up from under 60 the year before. The EPA also touts seizing more than 1.5 million pounds of illegal or mislabeled chemicals coming into the country. Analysts say that fits with the administration's emphasis on protecting domestic industries while focusing enforcement on foreign products, but it is a small slice of the larger environmental enforcement picture.
Let's talk about the real-world consequences here. Have we already seen changes in pollution and public health?
Yes, and they are significant. The Rhodium Group, an independent research firm often cited by major outlets, reported that United States greenhouse gas emissions rose by about 2.4% in 2025, after several years of declines. They attribute part of that jump to the broader deregulatory push rolling back climate rules tied to the old endangerment finding, loosening car pollution standards, and formally re-withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement early last year. Those policy shifts, combined with weaker enforcement, make it easier for high-emitting industries to ramp up production without investing in cleaner technology.
What about air quality for everyday people? Are more communities breathing dirtier air now?
The American Lung Association's most recent State of the Air report paints a worrying picture. It found that about 156 million Americans, close to half the country, now live in counties that fail federal standards for smog or soot. That is roughly 25 million more people breathing unhealthy air than just a year earlier. Health organizations, including medical societies focused on climate, say weaker enforcement at industrial facilities is one reason those numbers are heading in the wrong direction.
And on the water side, there was that Supreme Court case and some new EPA guidance. How are those factoring in?
In March of last year, the Supreme Court decided San Francisco versus EPA, a ruling that narrowed the agency's leverage over certain dischargers. Then, in December, the EPA issued what it calls a narrative compliance memo, signaling it would move away from rigid numerical pollution limits in many water permits. Environmental lawyers told outlets like EHN and Regional Public Radio that, combined, those moves make it much harder to control nutrient runoff and so-called forever chemicals like PFAS. Without strong federal enforcement, many of those pollutants are left to state discretion, and the watchdogs say states are often not stepping in.
You mentioned PFAS, those forever chemicals. What do we know about exposure risks now?
A leaked internal EPA report from spring of last year, described by the Center for American Progress and other advocacy groups, suggested about 26 million people may be drinking water with problematic levels of certain PFAS compounds, including PFNA. These substances have been linked to lower birth weights, reproductive issues, and some cancers. The Trump administration halted work on nationwide PFAS drinking water limits, arguing the science and costs were uncertain. Health experts say that, with enforcement also weakened, communities have fewer tools to push polluters to clean up or pay for filtration.
How are these changes affecting low-income neighborhoods and communities of color, the so-called fence-line communities?
Those communities are bearing the brunt, according to groups like the Environmental Integrity Project and the Center for American Progress. These are neighborhoods already clustered near refineries, chemical plants, ports, and highways, and they historically relied on strong federal enforcement to keep pollution in check when local politics were stacked against them. Now, with fewer inspections and lawsuits, EIP says companies face what it calls a, quote, polluter's market, end quote, where paying occasional minor fines or paying nothing is cheaper than installing serious controls. That means more asthma attacks, more missed school and work days, and higher long-term cancer risks for residents who already have fewer resources to relocate or seek care.
The administration also changed how it counts the benefits of regulations, right? How does that play in?
In January of this year, the EPA finalized a rule saying it will no longer tally many health benefits, like avoided premature deaths, when it does cost-benefit analyses for new air rules. Legal analysts writing for Gable law sites and environmental law blogs say that makes it easier to justify rolling back protections, because the official math now undercounts what cleaner air is worth. When you combine that with weaker enforcement of the rules that remain, experts warn you get a double hit. Fewer strong standards are adopted, and the ones on the books are less likely to be fully enforced.
Politically, how is Administrator Lee Zeldin framing all of this to the public?
Zeldin has been very blunt about his goals. According to NPR and E! News, he called a big deregulation package last March, quote, the most consequential day of deregulation in American history, end quote, targeting more than 24 Biden-era climate and pollution safeguards. In a speech to industry leaders, he went even further, saying he wanted to, quote, drive a dagger into the heart of the climate change religion, end quote. Supporters in the fossil fuel and manufacturing sectors say this is finally easing what they see as excessive red tape, while environmental groups and many scientists argue it is dismantling decades of progress, just as the past 3 years have been the hottest ever recorded.
Looking ahead, what are watchdogs and analysts saying needs to happen to reverse this trend?
They are calling for a restoration of staff, budgets, and legal tools at both the EPA and the Justice Department. EDGI and the Center for American Progress argue that simply shifting more responsibility to states will not work unless Congress restores the federal grants that help state agencies function. Some legal scholars suggest that future administrations could quickly ramp up enforcement again, using the same laws, but they warn that every year of weak deterrence lets companies lock in dirtier practices and infrastructure. In the meantime, groups like EIP say they will keep publishing these data-heavy reports to make it harder for any administration of either party to quietly scale back enforcement without public scrutiny.
For listeners who do care about cleaner air and water, is there any sign of pushback or pressure building?
There is growing pressure from public health groups, city and state officials, and even some businesses that have invested in cleaner technology and feel undercut by lax enforcement on competitors. The American Lung Association and allied medical organizations are urging Congress to hold oversight hearings on the enforcement decline, something NPR stations around the country have been tracking closely. Some states, mostly those with stronger environmental records already, are beginning to pass tougher local standards, but they only cover part of the population. Overall, watchdogs say the data from 2025 is a wake-up call about how fast federal enforcement can be dismantled and how hard it may be to rebuild.
Lot to take in this morning. Chloe, thanks for breaking down the numbers and the stakes for us.
Thank you, Grace.
Here are some other headlines. ICE is on thin ice with the public. APBS News/NPR/Marist poll released February 5th finds 60% of Americans now disapprove of the agency, and 62% say its Operation Metro Surge tactics are making communities less safe. The backlash follows January raids in Minneapolis where federal agents shot and killed 2 U.S. citizens, Renee Nicole Good and Alex Preddy. Under fire, White House border czar Tom Homan on February 4th ordered an immediate withdrawal of 700 immigration officers from Minnesota, about a 25% cut, leaving roughly 2,000 agents in the Twin Cities. He credits unprecedented cooperation from local jails, which are transferring custody of undocumented immigrants so officers can scale back street operations. Governor Tim Walz and Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey welcomed the move, but still label the remaining crackdown a campaign of retribution and demand it end. Homan says operations will continue wherever local officials cooperate and protesters stop interfering. In Washington, the dispute has frozen budget negotiations. A partial government shutdown was narrowly avoided, with a 2-week funding patch for the Department of Homeland Security that expires February 13th. Democratic leaders and big city mayors insist they won't approve long-term DHS funding without reforms, mandatory body-worn cameras, judicial warrants for entering private property, and tighter limits on arrests at sensitive locations like homes, workplaces, and schools. In Minnesota, 2 school districts and a teachers' union have already sued to block federal enforcement at campuses, citing plunging attendance and student safety fears, while local officials warn surprise workplace raids are hurting the regional economy. Analysts link a 31-point swing in a recent Texas special election to anger over mass deportations, warning the politics may be shifting faster than policy can keep up. The Washington Post is rewriting its own front page. On February 4th, the paper announced a strategic reset that will cut about 1/3 of its workforce, including more than 300 newsroom jobs, amid a 50% drop in organic search traffic and rising competition from AI-generated news. The shakeup shutters the iconic sports section, closes the books department, cancels the flagship Post Reports podcast, and eliminates the entire Middle East team plus several foreign bureaus, sharply shrinking international coverage. The cuts follow subscriber losses after owner Jeff Bezos blocked a 2024 presidential endorsement. Former executive editor Marty Barron calls the overhaul self-inflicted brand destruction and warns the narrower focus could trigger a death spiral for the paper's global influence. The Washington Post Newspaper Guild says hollowing out the newsroom will have irreversible consequences for its credibility and reach. Overseas, Nigeria is mourning its deadliest extremist attack of 2026. Officials say suspected ISIS-linked Lakurawa militants stormed the villages of Woro and Nuku in normally more stable Kwara State, killing between 162 and 170 people and abducting at least 35 women. Witnesses report residents were rounded up, bound, executed, and their homes, shops, and a traditional ruler's palace set ablaze. President Bola Tinubu has ordered an army battalion into the region under Operation Savannah Shield, while the Defense Ministry confirms a small U.S. military team is in the country providing intelligence support as jihadist violence spreads westward from the Sahel. And a sweeping ProPublica investigation finds America's harvest rests on increasingly unprotected hands. As growers rely more on farm labor contractors, reporters document rampant abuses, wage theft, illegal recruitment fees, and overcrowded substandard housing, while growers shift legal liability to middlemen. The U.S. Labor Department completed just 649 agricultural investigations in the most recent year, the lowest since 2000, and even a fatal heat stress case brought only a $16,433 fine, with the contractor allowed to keep operating. The Trump administration has suspended enforcement of a 2024 rule designed to strengthen H-2A visa protections, leaving millions of migrant and domestic farm workers more vulnerable. United Farm Workers President Teresa Romero says the rollback rewards negligent employers. After years of Government Accountability Office warnings, advocates warn the country is feasting on cheap produce while the people who pick it work in a widening enforcement vacuum. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with GPT-5, Gemini Pro 3, Gemini Flash 3, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.